Hello, 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 everyone. My name is John Sierra, and I'm a Tolkien scholar. And what that means is that I have studied the works of J.R.R. Tolkien for a very long time, in depth, and I'm the kind of guy that you can come and ask any sort of question about The Lord of the Rings, The Hobbit, The Silmarillion, Unfinished Tales, or of any of his other works, and I will come to you with a well-researched and thoughtful answer. So, that being said, we do have 10 questions to get through, and it is actually rather late right now. I was doing some other things, and then I realized, I have to record. So I'm not going to be dilly-dallying too much. I'm not going to be rushing either, but I'm not going to be dilly-dallying too much. Let me just explain how this all works. Of course, if you want to ask me a question, you can leave a comment. I actually like when you guys leave comments, whether it's a question or just to say hi or whatever. It helps the algorithm and helps get the channel recommended to other people. So that if you want to ask a question there, you can ask a question there, but I will answer you there. If you want your question to be featured in a video, there's 2 ways to submit it, and keep in mind that if you do that, it won't be an instant answer that will come back like within 1 or 2 days. It'll be like a while, but you'll be featured in a video if you do it this way. So there's 2 ways to do it. One is through a website called Quora. So Quora is a knowledge sharing platform where you can ask any question and have a person, or I should say multiple people, with relevant knowledge or experience or wisdom or education answer your question. If you ask any sort of question about Tolkien on there, you're going to be recommended people to request to answer your question. I'm going to be on or near the top of that list. There is, of course, a link to my Quora account in the description of this video. If you want to not use Quora, you want to stay here on YouTube, you're going to have to pick up the mobile app. For some reason, this doesn't work on desktop. I don't know why, but go to the mobile app, go to my channel, click visit community, and then you can make a post there, and I will consider that a submission for an answer. If I reply to you with an answer, it means it's not something that's going to take up a whole lot of time, so I won't feature it in a video, and I'll just answer you there. If you submit something there and it disappears, it means that I am answering you. I just wanted to keep it clean and not have it, because if I have everything that everybody's ever posted in there, it becomes hard to find the new ones. That being said, like the video, hit the hype button if you see it, subscribe to the channel if you haven't already, and let's do a reading. So I thought it might be fun to read something from the book The Return of the Shadow, which is some of the very early drafts of The Lord of the Rings, most particularly the early stuff, The Fellowship of the Ring. So it's sort of like a primordial version of The Fellowship of the Ring, with several different drafts in there. I have a little bit from the Council of Elrond, from a little bit of a later thing, a later draft that I'm going to read later as an answer to one of my questions here. But I wanted to read from one of the earliest drafts, because if you look at Tolkien's first draft of any story, it's always so interesting to see how different it is from the final draft. And we talked about this not too long ago with the earliest draft of The Hobbit, and how Gandalf was a wizard called Bladderthin, and that the name Gandalf was actually used for a dwarf, who later was renamed to Thorin Oakenshield. So it's sort of interesting to see the changes in names. So just to set this up, this is the scene in The Prancing Pony where they're going to read Gandalf's letter, and they're going to meet the character that would later become Strider or Aragorn. Except in this, he's not a man, he's a hobbit, and he's not called Strider, he's called Trotter. Some of the other names are different. Frodo is actually called Bingo. He's Bingo Baggins, but there is a character in this version that is called Frodo. He's Frodo Took. So you could see how the names got switched around a little bit there. There is also an Odo Took. Both Frodo Took and Odo Took are Bingo's younger nephews in this version, and they sort of became Sam and Pippin, really. It is what happened there. And of course, Trotter became Aragorn after a time, and he wasn't a hobbit anymore. But we're going to read this part. So here we are. Let's start actually here. There! It is past, he said, and after a moment, throwing back his hood and pushing his hair from his face, perhaps I know or more about these riders than even you do. You do not fear them enough yet, but it seems very likely enough to me that news of you will reach them before the night is old. Tomorrow you will have to go swiftly and secretly if possible, but Trotter can take you by ways that are little trod. Will you have him?" Bingo made no answer. He looked at Trotter, grim and wild and rough-clad. It was hard to know what to do. He did not doubt that most of his tale was true, borne out as it was by the landlord's account. But it was less easy to feel sure of his good intent. He had a dark look, and yet there was something in it, and in his speech which often strayed from the rustic matter of the rangers and bree-folk, that seemed friendly and even familiar. The silence grew, and still Bingo could not make up his mind. "Well, I'm for Trotter if you want any help in deciding," said Frodo at last. "In any case, I dare say he could follow us wherever he went, even if we refused." "Thank you," said Trotter, smiling at Frodo. "I could, and I should, for I should feel it my duty. But here is a letter which I have to you. I dare say it will help you to make up your mind." To Bingo's amazement, he took from a pocket a small sealed letter and handed it over. On the outside it was inscribed, "B from G." "Read it," said Trotter. Bingo looked carefully at the seal before he broke it. It seemed undoubtedly to be Gandalf's, as the writing in the Rhûn. Inside was the following message. Bingo read it out loud. "Monday morning, September 26th. Dear B, can't stop long in Bree, not for the night if you can help it. Have learned some news on the way. Pursuit is getting close. There are 7 at least, perhaps more. On no account use it again, not even for a joke. Don't move in dark or mist. Push along by day. Try and catch me up. I cannot wait here for you, but I shall go slow for a day or 2. Look out for our camp on Weathertop Hill. I shall wait there as long as I dare. I am giving this to a ranger, wild hobbit known as Trotter. He is dark, long-haired, has wooden shoes. You can trust him. He is an old friend of mine and knows a great deal. He will guide you to Weathertop, and further if necessary. Push along. Yours, Gandalf." Bingo looked at the trailing handwriting. It seemed as plainly genuine as the seal. "Well, Trotter," he said, "if you had told me right away that you had this letter, it would have smoothed things out a lot and saved a lot of talk. But why did you invent all that about eavesdropping?" "I did not," laughed Trotter. "I gave old Gandalf quite a start when I popped up from behind the hedge. I told him he was lucky that it was an old friend. We had a long talk about various things. Bilbo and Bingo and the ring, if you want to know. He was very pleased to see me, as he was in a hurry and yet anxious to get in touch with you." "Well, I must admit I am glad to have a word from him," said Bingo. "And if you are a friend of Gandalf's, then we are lucky to meet you. I am sorry if I was unnecessarily suspicious." "You weren't," said Trotter. "You weren't half suspicious enough. If you had had previous experience of your present enemy, you would not trust your own hands without a good look, once you knew that he was on your track. Now I am suspicious, and I have to make quite sure that you were genuine first, before handing over any letter. I've heard of shadow parties picking up messages that were not meant for them. It has been done by enemies before now. Also, if you want to know, it amused me to see if I could induce you to take me on, just by my gifts of persuasion. It would have been nice, though quite wrong, if you had accepted me for my manners without testimonial. But there, I suppose my looks are against me." "They are," said Odo, laughing. "But handsome is as handsome does, we say in the Shire. And anyway, I dare say we shall all look much the same before long after lying in hedges and ditches." "It will take more than a few days or weeks or years wandering into the world to make you look like Trotter," he answered, and Odo subsided. "You would die first unless you were made of tougher stuff than you look to be." "What are we to do?" said Bingo. "I don't altogether understand this letter. Gandalf said don't stay in Bree. Is Barnabas Butterbur all right?" "Perfectly," said Trotter. "A sound a hobbit as you would find between the West Towers and Rivendell. Faithful, kind, shrewd enough in his plain business, but not over-curious about anything but the daily events among the simple Bree folk. If anything strange happens, he just invents an explanation or else forgets it. Queer, he says, and scratches his head, and then goes back to his larder or his brew house. That is just as well for you. I expect he has now convinced himself that there was some mistake, and that the light was tricky, and that all the hobbits in the room merely imagined that Mr. Hill disappeared. The Black Riders will become ordinary travelers looking for a friend in a week or 2, if they don't come back." So that's a bit there. So you could see the similarities there, especially the discussion between Odo, who is sort of the prototypical version of Pippin, though there's a lot of Sam in him as well, and Trotter, who of course would become Strider, and how they go back and forth, and it's like, well, if I keep traveling out here in the wilderness, and I might look like you, and that would take a long time. That little exchange pretty much survived to the final draft, just of course with the names changed. Also note that instead of Barlaman Butterbur, we have Barnabas Butterbur, and that he is a hobbit in this early draft. So most of the characters are hobbits, because at this point, Tolkien is really just writing a sequel to The Hobbit. He's calling it The Return of the Shadow, but he's and it's about the necromancer, and he is revealing that the necromancer is named Sauron, and that he made the rings. Of course, we'll talk a little bit more about that later, because of course we know that Sauron didn't make the rings in the final version. Like I said, a lot of things got changed around there, but you can see the basic bones of it. Gandalf's letter, the landlord, and everything. It's interesting that in this version, Trotter has the letter himself and hands it to Bingo, who would become Frodo later on. And in fact, later on, when it was all revised, it was actually Barlaman, the landlord, who had the letter and was supposed to actually mail it to Frodo, but then forgot to. And then when he saw this suspicious fellow, this Mr. Underhill, in the early version there, it was Mr. Hill was the pseudonym that Bingo used. He thought, I think that's that Baggins guy oh my God, I'm supposed to give him that letter, and that it was, of course, very, very important. So in this version, it's actually Trotter that gives him the letter explaining who Trotter is. The rune is different. You do see the rune that was used for Gandalf in his signature, but the one that he uses as his emblem is completely different. So there's that as well. And but like I said, he was writing the Hobbit Part 2, basically. So it was a story really about 6 hobbits traveling in a kind of a local adventure. Notice that they're trying to catch up to Gandalf. He's ahead of them, and they're trying to catch up to him. That's a little bit different from the fact where they're waiting for Gandalf to show up, and he has not showed up, and they're worried about him. And then, of course, it's, later on in Book 2, we find out that he had been captured by Saruman. Saruman does exist in the early drafts. He's a bit different, of course, as well. The Ents are working for him, for example. Treebeard is his minion. There's a lot of cool stuff. That would be in the Treason of Isengard. You could read the earlier drafts there. But yeah, let me grab that, actually. I put the book down, but in this, just want to show you this. If you ever want to read the early drafts of The Lord of the Rings, it comes in 4 volumes. I have it here as a single volume there, which is why it's so big. But they are called The Return of the Shadow, The Treason of Isengard, The War of the Ring, and Sauron Defeated. And you get plenty of Tolkien's different drafts and explanations as to how it all fits together. And you see the early ideas, and then the middle ideas, and then the later ideas. And you get Christopher's notes and everything. There was a point there when I was reading when I kind of paused when he said about the ring, if we're being honest, because Tolkien actually penciled in writers and the as a correction. But as I was skipping over a lot of the annotations from Christopher to do sort of a more dramatic reading, I just sort of like glazed over that. But there are even things that are typescript. There are things that are manuscript, and this is sort of like studying these texts is a lot of where it comes from, because sometimes there's holes, not plot holes, but there's holes in our knowledge about the final versions of The Lord of the Rings or the Silmarillion. And to fill them in, we actually have to look at the earlier drafts and stuff that was not used, and then decide, does this still work with the Legendarium? And that's why I don't like really getting into things like what is canon. Is the Book of Lost Tales canon, or is it not? There's elements of it that would contradict the story that we know in the Silmarillion, and there's elements that flesh out the Silmarillion. But then we can say, though, like, the Book of Lost Tales is sort of the mortal man's perspective of the First Age, and it's very rich and detailed. The Silmarillion is, it's unfinished, and that's why it's not very rich and very detailed. But it is the Elvish account and we're inclined to believe the Elvish account over the mortal account. But Tolkien's idea was that there are ideas from both that are valid, and then there are ideas in both that are not really what really happened, but just the way the things were written down, and that sometimes the truth was quite very different, which you see in a much later volume of the History of Middle-earth, Morgoth's Ring, explains a lot of that. Anyway, guys, let's get on to the questions. I'm eager to answer them, so here we go. Let's go on. Start with the first question. Our first question comes in by the request of Norma, who asks, do we have anything at all about the place of Rhûn and who governs it? So the truth of the matter is that Rhûn is not really a place. People tend to think of Rhûn as this country that's in the east of Middle-earth, much like they think of Harad as a country that's in the south of Middle-earth. However, the truth, as usual, lies in the linguistics involved here. Rhûn is just the Sindarin Elvish word that means east. So any land that's to the east of where you happen to be is Rhûn. Similarly, Harad is the Sindarin Elvish word that means the south. So similarly, Easterling is a person from the east. Haradrim is a person from the south. You sort of see what I'm getting there. The lands to the east are largely a mystery. We don't know how many different lands and countries are out there. We don't know what form of governance there was or what sort of culture they had. I would imagine that there are a great many lands out there and they have a great many different cultures. The idea of men from the east being called Easterlings even appears in the First Age, but what's really interesting there, when you read, primarily the Children of Húrin has characters that are called Easterlings, and when you read it, it's a satellite story of the Silmarillion. It takes place in Beleriand. So because it's in Beleriand, Easterlings are men that are coming from over the Misty Mountains, and they would actually have more in common with sort of the ancestors of the Rohirrim than they would have in common with the Easterlings that are mentioned in the Lord of the Rings, because that's even further to the east. Middle-earth is quite a lot bigger than what you see on the map when you look at the map in the back of the Lord of the Rings. It's a supercontinent. It's very big, and it's roughly analogous to Europe and Africa and Asia all together. So the part that you see on the map is just the Europe part, and at the edge of the map you see Rhûn, which is just to indicate the eastern lands. Now, what we know of it in reference to the Lord of the Rings is that these lands were long ago conquered by Sauron. So the government there, at least during that point in time, is just, the same as the government in Mordor. It's just complete and total subservience to Sauron. We know that the first few wizards to arrive, which would be the Blue Wizards and then later Saruman, traveled to these lands as well as the lands to the south, though Saruman eventually returned to the northwest. We know that once the One Ring was destroyed, the invading Easterlings, who were mostly engaged in a war in the north against the united forces of Dale and Erebor, they just went home, which sort of suggests that without Sauron's power over them, they really don't have any quarrel with the free peoples of Middle-earth. They're being, forced into this war. But that's pretty much all we know about it. Sorry that I don't have more information, but Tolkien didn't really write about the lands that were off the map that much, really. All right, let's move on to the next question. Here's a question that comes in from Alex Robert, who asks, in the Lord of the Rings book, do the Fellowship escape the Chamber of Mazarbul by a different door than which they entered, rather than the same door as depicted in the Fellowship of the Ring movie? Now, it was different. They didn't go out the same way in the book. It's important to note that there isn't a singular path that goes through Moria. There's a lot of different ways to get through it because it is, after all, it's a city. The chamber of Mazarbul was a room that they noticed off the side to the hall, and they noticed by the fact that the door was a little open and they could see a large beam of light coming down, and they were curious, so they entered, and that's where they found Balin's tomb, and Gandalf found the Book of Mazarbul, which told the story of what happened to Balin's expedition. When they're done, and Gandalf is asked where they're going to go next, he simply states, back to the hall. So the intention was to go out the same door. But once the orcs started showing up, there was really no other way out that they knew of at first. And I'm going to read you a little bit here. "They are coming," cried Legolas. "We cannot get out," said Gimli. "Trapped," cried Gandalf. "Why did I delay? Here we are, caught just as they were before. But I was not here then. We will see what..." Doom, doom, came the drum beat and the walls shook. So then they discover that there's actually another exit, which is it's referred to as the Eastern Door. Boromir wants to actually just bar up all the doors to stop anybody from coming in, but then Gandalf thinks, well, then we're going to be sort of in the same situation that Balin's company was in, and they only attempt to bar the door that goes out to the hall, which is the one they came in. The other door, they only call it the Eastern Door, is said to go... There's just a drop off. It's like you go through the door and there's immediately a great stairway that goes straight down. So they eventually do go through this door, and everybody sort of runs ahead, and Gandalf stops to try and stop up the orcs by closing the door using magic. But then there's a counter spell which creates a big explosion and blasts Gandalf backwards, and he tumbles all the way down the stairs. And Gandalf states that whatever this was his equal, and that the magic clash nearly killed him. And of course this leads to this great chase down towards the bridge, where the evil presence is revealed to be a Balrog. And the orcs, they're not able to get through the rubble and go the same way that the Fellowship went, so they go a different way, but then they're stopped because there's a big flaming chasm in their way, and the Balrog leaps over the flaming chasm, so it's all very exciting. The movie made the chamber actually a lot bigger than it was in the book, but they're not revealing the Balrog just yet at that moment. It's a little bit later, so they didn't do the scene where Gandalf tried to seal the door with magic and there was an explosion and all that. They just skipped the other door entirely since they weren't going to do that. All right, let's move on to the next question. Our next question comes in by the request of Farmer Hal, who asks, what is the philosophy and significance of the tale of Aragorn and Arwen in Tolkien's Legendarium? So, when I have to just talk a little bit about the idea of the question that's being presented here. Whenever we ask about the philosophy of anything Tolkien related, we have to be very careful to not try to pigeonhole the reader into a specific interpretation, because that would fly in the face of the author's intent. Now, I will use the words here of the author's son, Christopher Tolkien. He pointed out at one point that people will find allegory as they may, which essentially means that many people who read a story, it doesn't have to be The Lord of the Rings, it could be any story, they're going to ascribe their own personal interpretation to the author's intent. And I'll give you an example of something that I have somewhat, we'll say, secondhand knowledge of. I had a casual acquaintance that was a professor, and she told me once about a student who wrote a research paper about the song American Pie by Don McLean. And in the research paper, the student missed the intended allegory of the lyrics, which is the history of rock and roll told through its rapid-fire barrage of metaphor. And instead, the student interpreted it as a biblical allegory. And the student, in this case, was completely wrong about the intention of the author with his lyrics. But they did such a great job of arguing their point that they got a good grade. So when it comes to scholarship of any particular work, it's sort of a pitfall to proclaim your own personal application as if it was the author's allegory. Now, Christopher Tolkien goes on to say that anyone and everyone will come up with their own interpretations, and that's a good thing in and of itself. It's exactly what his father wanted, but the issue is that they will assume that their interpretation is the intention of the author. And Christopher says that if we know this and we accept it to be a fact, that doesn't mean that you can't find the thoughts of the author in his work, and this goes for every single bit of fiction that's ever written. So Tolkien's philosophy with the tale of Aragorn and Arwen can be seen as his own thoughts on love and marriage, backed up by his own letters, particularly the letters that he wrote to his sons. Aragorn meets Arwen when he's about 20 years old. He just turned 20, really, and it should be noted that by the standards of his own people, the Dunedain, he's not even considered a true adult at this point. The Númenóreans had longer lifespans, and though they've diminished over time, Aragorn is a direct descendant of Elros. It's actually Elrond's brother. He was the first king of Númenor, and he lived to be 500 years old, and it became typical for his descendants to live to be about 300 to 400 years old. Though this is a lot later, Aragorn actually winds up living to be 210 years old. So it's established in another story called Aldarion and Arendis, the Mariner's Wife, that the age of majority for Númenórean men is actually 25. So Tolkien was not writing Aragorn as this sort of self-insert. It's interesting to see the mirroring, though, with his own life. Tolkien met his future wife when he was not quite an adult. He was 17 years old. And, he was born in South Africa. He moved to England with his mother when he was only 3 years old. And his father stayed behind because they were there on a work thing. His father was a banker, and there was a big promotion in it for this whole trip to South Africa. But his father never made it home. He got sick and he died. So he never returned to England. So Tolkien didn't really grow up knowing his father. So his father figure was this guy, Francis Morgan, and he was a very conservative Catholic priest. And Morgan told Tolkien that he cannot marry Edith unless A, she converts to Catholicism, and B, he can't propose to her until he's 21 years old. And Tolkien went along with this, and Edith went along with this because they loved each other so much, and she converted to his religion. I believe she was in the Church of England prior, and they were engaged almost immediately after his 21st birthday. So, in the years between there, Tolkien was very frustrated. His frustration was very palpable. And as a direct consequence, we can see his enlistment in the army, his first year of university, where he was a bit of a troublemaker. He described the experience of waiting to marry Edith as this grueling process. And even after he married her, his military service kept them apart a lot, and then he almost died of trench fever. And it was during his convalescence that he wrote the very first version of a story that we know as Beren and Luthien. Tolkien described Edith as his Luthien, though he did not compare himself specifically to Beren. He thinks himself not nearly as brave or as heroic as Beren. Luthien, giving up her immortality to be with Beren, is his own feelings about his wife, who gave up her sect of Christianity to be with him. So then we move over to the Lord of the Rings, and we learn from reading the earlier drafts that Arwen wasn't actually a part of the story at all. She was a very late addition to the story, which is why she's kind of barely in the book at all, and the unfinished backstory, the tale of Aragorn and Arwen, is presented as an excerpt in the appendix. We don't get a lot of the grand romance, but we see the mirroring. Elrond tells Aragorn that he must be king to marry Arwen. Thingol had told Beren that he must recover a Silmaril from Morgoth's crown to marry Luthien. Francis Morgan tells Tolkien he must wait until he's 21 and he can only marry a Catholic. Edith is more closely mirrored by Luthien than she is by Arwen. After all, it does say Luthien on her gravestone. The onus is put on Beren to do the impossible, but he's unable to do it, and he actually fails until Luthien assists him, and basically she winds up doing most of the work. In this, we can see Tolkien's thoughts about his wife. Yeah, he had to wait until he was 21, and that was very annoying to him, but she had to give up her religion that she was raised in and leave the church that she went to. And I don't think I need to tell you, which the author perceived to be the greater sacrifice. Arwen was added to the story because once Tolkien realized, hey, Aragorn, he started as Trotter, now he's Aragorn, and he's becoming more like a Third Age XP of Beren. So he drops the idea that he had at the moment, which was that Aragorn was going to marry Éowyn, and Éowyn herself was actually a composite of a few other characters, and he introduced Arwen to the story as the XP for Luthien. Unfortunately, because she was added at such a late stage, and Tolkien was being pressured to finish the story because he had already taken like 20 years writing it, he didn't get to fully flesh her out. He didn't get to add the entire romance, so we just get this excerpt that's added in the appendix. One could see the tale being integrated into the story, most likely relayed to Frodo by probably Bilbo, because he was close friends with Aragorn and Arwen. And this goes into Tolkien's later complaint that The Lord of the Rings was too short. This, the significance, of course, to this is tied into the idea of the return of the king. Not only a return of a king to Arnor and Gondor, but a return to an earlier standard of the great heroes of the First Age, though in a diminished state, still grandiose for their time. Aragorn falls in love with Arwen when he's 20 years old, and he finally marries her at the age of 88. So there's this 68-year courtship that shows his dedication to not only his destiny as the king, but his willingness to be with the one that he loves no matter what it costs. We also see how essential Arwen is to his victory, just like, Luthien was essential to Beren's eventual victory, because the arrival of her brothers with the Númenórean standard, which struck terror into the forces of Sauron at Pelennor Fields that she had made, it's not as significant as Luthien putting Morgoth to sleep, but, nothing in the Third Age compares to anything that happened in the First Age. It's all very diminished. So there you go. There's my thoughts on it. Let's move on to the next question. Our next question comes in by the request of Christopher Pansner, who asks, is the White Tree of Rohan from The Lord of the Rings based on a real tree that is living or lived in the past? There isn't a White Tree of Rohan. Rohan's heraldry and culture is not based around trees, it's based around horses, hence the name Riddermark, which is Mark of the Cavalry, and in Sindarin it's Rohan, which means horse country. Of course, the White Tree was the heraldry of Gondor, so you're asking actually about the White Tree of Gondor. The White Tree is not inspired by any real-life tree or trees, but it has deep roots in Tolkien's own mythology. There's a Tolkien scholar named John Garth who made the comparison to the dry tree that was discovered by Marco Polo, but, it's an apt comparison, but it's not likely that that was his actual inspiration. The White Tree's origins go back to the first darkening of Middle-earth, when Melkor, who is Satan, cast down the great towers that had these lamps on them that lit the world, and it left the world in darkness. And the Ainur, that is to say the angels, retreated to the west, to the Undying Lands, and they left Middle-earth in this seemingly eternal nighttime, though one of them, Varda, created extra stars so that when the elves awoke, they would have some light. In the Undying Lands to the west, another one of the angels, Yavanna, created two great trees known as Laurelin the Gold and Telperion the Silver, which they would wax and wane and create this night and day cycle in the country there called Valinor. When elves came to the Undying Lands, they preferred the silver tree, Telperion, because they had an affinity for nighttime, because that's where they awoke, under the stars. After Melkor and Ungoliant, who was this giant spider demon, they destroyed the trees. And many of the elves, most especially the Falmari elves, they lamented the loss of the trees, and especially of Telperion the Silver, because they loved the soft, white glow that was just like the stars. Varda and Aule, they managed to save a flower of Telperion and a fruit of Laurelin, and that became the moon and the sun. And they were born high into the air by these Maiar spirits. They're also angels called Tilion and Arwen. And this arrangement meant that the light source was far out of the reach of Melkor in the sky, but also they could provide light to not just the Undying Lands, but Middle-earth and the whole world, And this would end the nightfall in Middle-earth. Even with the moon and the sun, though, the Falmari elves in the west, like I said, they really missed Telperion. They really liked it. So the Valar created a lesser replacement, which was a tree called Galathilion, which just means white tree. And that stood on the hill of Tuna. One of Galathilion's saplings, which was named Celeborn, which means silver tree, not to be confused with Galadriel's husband, who has the same name, and this one was placed in an island called Tol Eressëa. And then Celeborn had a sapling that was called Nimloth, which means white blossom. And then this was given to the king of Númenor at the time by the visiting elves of Eressëa as a mark of friendship. And this king, his name is Tar Aldarion, and he was a great lover of ships. So to him, a tree was wood. It was a resource to build ships with, and he started wondering, hey, that's a great tree. I wonder what kind of ship I can make out of that. And the elves explained to him, that's not really what it's for. This is a tree that you're just supposed to appreciate how beautiful it is, just for its own merit, which is a lesson that Yavanna taught the elves. And this was a lesson that Tar Aldarion took to heart. And he placed the tree in his palace's courtyard to be beloved by all. Now, Nimloth was eventually destroyed by Sauron because he cut it down and he burned it to create the sacrificial fires in the Temple of Melkor that he'd established in Númenor. Thankfully, there was a certain Númenorian, a guy you might have heard of. His name was Isildur, and he kind of figured this was going to happen. So the night before it all went down, he stole one of Nimloth's fruits. And then he planted it in secret, and it created a sapling, and that grew from when it was taken by Isildur to Middle-earth, and it was thankfully on one of Elendil's ships when the Akalabeth happened, and Númenor was destroyed. So the tree was planted in Isildur's city, the Minas Ithil, but then it was destroyed when Sauron invaded. And Isildur, again, he had a backup plan. He had a sapling, and this is the second white tree of Gondor, and he placed it in his late brother, Anarion's city, Minas Anor, and that was in memory of his slain brother. So the tree lasted until there was a great plague that swept through Gondor, and then there was another sapling that was put in its place by the king at the time. His name was Tarandor. The king had the tree put in the courtyard of Minas Anor, which was now called Minas Tirith, until well after the line of kings ended. And around the time that the 21st ruling steward, Belecthir II, died, that's when this tree died. And there was no sapling, so they just left the dead tree there in perpetuity. There was a prophecy made that the white tree will not return to Gondor until the return of the king. After the coronation of Aragorn II Elisar as King of Gondor, Aragorn and Gandalf traveled up the slopes of Mindoluin. That's the mountain that's right behind Minas Tirith, which sort of acted as its natural defenses, and they discovered a new sapling. It is important that Aragorn, trying to become the king, receives as many endorsements as he possibly can, and this started early on with Elrond and Galadriel, but during The Lord of the Rings, he picks up a lot of endorsements. Most notable ones would be Éomer, the king of Rohan, the last ruling steward Faramir, and Gandalf the White, who placed the crown on Aragorn's head, essentially giving Aragorn the endorsement of the angels. The blossoming of a new sapling centuries after the death of the third white tree of Gondor is a miracle. And this miracle could only be seen as the endorsement of Aragorn by Middle-earth itself, and by extension the endorsement of the one true god Eru Ilúvatar. So seeing the new tree was this deeply significant experience for Aragorn, because he knows what comes next. Elrond's going to arrive, hand him the scepter that marks him as the king of Arnor, fulfilling his destiny of reuniting the two kingdoms that once made up Elendil's realm, and the thing that Aragorn, as I mentioned earlier, had been working at for 68 years, the wedding to Arwen. Now, I want to note that it was Arwen who created the great standard that struck terror into the hearts of Sauron's forces. We talked about that in the last answer. And that on that standard was the White Tree and Seven Stars, which is the heraldry of both Gondor and Númenor, the return of Sauron's old enemy to defeat him again, and the endurance of the Light of the Valar, even after being cast down and destroyed by Melkor and cast down and destroyed by Sauron many times over. All right, let's move on to the next question. Our next question comes in by the request of Adriel, who asks, is it true that Tolkien took inspiration of the Orcs from the Gog and Magog from the Bible and the Koran? No, it's not even remotely true. The Gog and Magog thing in the Bible is actually open to a lot of interpretation, but one of the most common interpretations is that Gog and Magog refer to both a King Magog and his people and the land they lived in, and the idea of monsters being associated with Magog and Gog is more of a Quran thing, where Gog and Magog is built upon the idea of the forces of evil and invading monsters. Tolkien's inspiration for orcs is more Eurocentric, the goblin myths that are found in just about every mythology of Europe. Tolkien even notes in The Hobbit that orc is just the Hobbit word for goblin, though we see widespread use of the term in The Lord of the Rings as a corruption of their own word for themselves, which is Uruk, as well as the Sindarin Yrk, which is used by the Elves of Lothlorien, and the Quenya Orcor. The in-universe usage of goblin can possibly be attributed to an English translation of the Druidan Gorgun, which might have been picked up by the early nomadic Perianath, that's the hobbits, before they settled in Eriador. Tolkien created orcs to just be these evil foot soldiers that could be mowed down by the heroes with impunity without wondering about who they were as people, because they were evil creatures. And this is something that he later actually deeply regretted, and he struggled with solidifying exactly what orcs were and what their origins were. He considered they were animated from stone. He considered they were corrupted elves. He considered they were mockeries of elves. He considered they were corrupted men. He considered that they were the byproduct of some men aligning with Melkor. And finally, sort of the last idea he came up with before he died was that they were animals. They were animalistic in nature, but they were made to mock the speaking peoples by Melkor's necromancy. Tolkien's legendarium was always sort of a work in progress right up until he died, and there were certain problems that he was working out in his mind, and his mind was bent upon these problems like Galadriel's history, the nature of the orcs, and there are specifically some Catholic, not broadly Christian or broadly religious themes, but specifically Catholic themes in The Lord of the Rings. And he once said that the single allusion to this that he put there purposefully in The Lord of the Rings was the lembas bread being sort of a stand-in for the Eucharist, which he explained this to Peter Hastings in a letter, that his work was not specifically religious and not theological in nature. It was just, the Eucharist being the lembas thing was just a thing he indulged himself in, and he thought it was even a little bit clumsy. His intent was always to write literature, not theology, so the fact that the orcs, which appear in nearly all of his stories, were not mentioned as an allusion in this letter where he's explaining what is religious in his work and what is inspired by the Bible, is pretty much all you need to know. Tolkien admitted what he pulled from his own religion, and it wasn't Gog and Magog. All right, let's move on to the next question. Our next question is not submitted anonymously, but it is submitted by somebody who goes by John Doe. Where did the gift of foresight or prophecy come from in the series? With Gandalf it makes sense, as he's a divine being, and to a lesser extent with elves like Rivendell, but there are other occasions where human characters prophecy events. So all gifts of prophecy either come from the Valar or from the one true god Eru Ilúvatar. Sometimes gifts of prophecy or other sight can come directly from the source of all such power, which is Ilúvatar, but most of the times it comes from him, but through the Valar. The example given of a prophetic dream visited a few times to Faramir and then once to Boromir is an example where we're pretty much directly told that it was the Valar, because the voice that spoke in that dream came out of a light from the west. Another example of this gift being directly gifted by the Valar was that they were specifically mentioned to have gifted Círdan the shipwright the greatest gift of foresight ever given to an elf, and this was at the end of the First Age, as Círdan had not gotten to fulfill his dream of sailing to the west and had actually chosen to stay in Middle-earth to assist all the other elves in getting to the west. It was important for him to have this intuition to know when there would no longer be any elves that are in Middle-earth that wanted to sail to the west so that he could finally go himself. These prophecies and other sight come through via a device known as the Asanwa, which is the exchange of thoughts without speaking that is shared by the angels, the elves, the men, all of them alike. The Asanwa is easier done by beings that don't have a Hroa, which is a real physical body that they are bound to. But anyone can do it. Even mortal men, if they are disciplined enough. The limitation of such a device is explained in long detail in the book The Nature of Middle-earth. The Asanwa can be used for more than just speaking to someone. You can send visions or mind pictures with it. And when it comes to mortals, the Valar learn that mind pictures should be sent to a mortal if they're sleeping, so that it comes to them as a dream, because if they're sent to somebody who's awake and they see these things, they don't realize that what they're seeing isn't real, and this can lead to misinterpretations and false prophecies, such as, I'm going to give an example, Andreth claiming that the spirit of Turin would destroy Ancalagon the Black, and then we know that didn't happen, the dragon was killed by Eärendil. So prophecies, they come to mortals in dreams. Ordinary dreams might be mistaken for prophecies or messages from the Valar, and some unscrupulous peoples could claim that they just foresaw something in their dreams when they actually did not. But for the most part, mortals need to be told that their dreams are messages and have them interpreted by the wise, which we see with Boromir. Boromir was he goes to his father Denethor, and he tells him about the dream that he had and the dream that Faramir had. It was the same dream. And out of the three key elements, a halfling, Isildur's Bane, and Imladris, the only one that Denethor was familiar with was Imladris. He knows, hey, that's an elvish country to the north called Rivendell, and that's where you should go. There is, of course, an unusually large amount of prophecies regarding Aragorn and his ascension as the king of Gondor and Arnor, and we're not told exactly who it was that received these prophecies. We just say, I've heard tell of this or that, Boromir and Faramir's dream alludes to the broken sword being mended, and by extension, the realm of Elendil being reunited by a high king, but these prophecies had been around for a while. The existence of seers in Gondor is not something that you need to boggle your mind about. Gondor has a long history of friendship with elves and the wise. Denethor is a little weird because he doesn't like wizards, but they love to collect knowledge and wisdom, and that's why they have their great scrolls and everything, and their lore masters and such. All right, let's move on to the next question. Our next question comes in from my YouTube mod, Dylan, who asks, why was Fingolfin's sword named Ringil along with the sea known as Ringil? Why do they have the same name? There's actually 3 Ringils in the Legendarium, and it will all make sense once we talk about what the word actually means. Now, if I were to ask someone who knows a great deal about Middle-earth's history, hey, quick, name the 2 lamps that lit Middle-earth during the Spring of Arda, and a lot of people would get it right. They would say, Ilu and Normal. And that's right, Now, but if I then ask, hey, what are the names of the towers that they were on? That's a little more difficult. That's harder to find. But the answer would be Ringil and Helkar. So the towers were said to be made by Melkor, and the lamps were made by Alin. This is back when Melkor was very briefly in collaboration with the other Valar. According to the possibly apocryphal accounts, I talked about this earlier, but I'm of the belief And there are parts of the Book of Lost Tales that do not contradict the Silmarillion, but just flesh it out, and that we could possibly accept these things as fact. Melkor told the Valar that the two towers were made out of this indestructible material. They just cannot be destroyed, which is a lie because he later destroyed them. Both Ringil and Helkar have the same meaning. They both basically mean cold. And this is apropos because one is in the far north and the one is in the far south. It's sort of like saying Arctic and Antarctic, just without the meaning of the one with the bears and the one that's opposite of the one with the bears. In the case of Ringil, it's sort of an elaborate way of saying cold. Cold in Elvish is Ringa, so Ringil is just sort of an elaborate way of saying it. And Helkar is ice cold, which we see in words like Helkaraxa, which is grinding ice. You may ask, why are there two Quenya words that mean cold? But then again, we could say cold, frigid, icy, frosty. There's a whole bunch of others. A lot of words in English that all basically mean the same thing, so it's not that unusual. In Elvish, Ringa seems to allude more to the feeling of cold, while Helkar is something that is cold, but that's not really a hard and fast rule. So the first Ringil would be the tower that beheld the golden lamp Ormo, and the second Ringil, which is the Sea of Ringil, was created when the tower fell. That's why they named it that. The third Ringil is of course, it's Fingolfin's sword, which he used in battle against Melkor when he was called Morgoth. One could easily think, well, that's like sort of saying cold steel, right? But it's a bit more poetic than that, which comes from this little excerpt from the Silmarillion. But Fingolfin gleamed beneath it as a star, for his mail was overlaid with silver, and his blue shield was set with crystals, and he drew his sword Ringil that glittered like ice. So the sea was named after the tower was named after the climate, and the sword was named because it glittered like ice. And there you have it. All right, let's move on to the next question. Our next question comes in by the request of Drew Astolfi, who asks, what do you suppose the Lesser Rings of Power could do? There's almost nothing about the Lesser Rings, actually. That's a tough one. There's a scant 2 mentions of Lesser Rings in the Lord of the Rings, not counting the Index. And they're not mentioned in the Silmarillion, and they're not mentioned in Unfinished Tales, and there's nothing really that illuminating to find about them in the history of Middle-earth. The fact that they didn't come up in the Return of the Shadow, except Christopher's notes, is interesting. I'm going to read you the passage from the Return of the Shadow. I told you we'd be coming back to this book that Christopher wrote a note about. I can tell you the part of the story that I know, answered Gandalf. In ancient days, the necromancer, the Dark Lord Sauron, made many magic rings of various properties that gave various powers to their possessors. He dealt them out lavishly and sowed them abroad to ensnare all peoples, but especially elves and men. For those that used the rings according to their strength and will of hearts fell quicker or slower under the power of the rings and the dominion of their maker. 3, 7, 9, and 1 he made of special potency, for their possessors became not only invisible to all in this world, if they wished, but could see both the world under the sun and the other side in which invisible things move. And they had what is called good luck and what seemed endless life, though, as I say, what power the rings conferred to each possessor depended on what use they made of them, on what they were themselves, and what they desired. So this passage is from an earlier draft. It's not the earliest draft. Frodo's not called Bingo in this. But in this early state, Tolkien was writing that all of the rings were made by Sauron, and that was later changed, that they were made by the elves, and Sauron only made the one ring. And there's a note there where Tolkien's son Christopher comments on 3, 7, 9, and 1, and he notes that his father penciled into correction that 9 and 3 should be swapped, so that it would be in descending order, so it should be 9, 7, 3, and 1. Christopher notes that this is the first time that his father thought of Lesser Rings and Rings of Power as separate entities, though the term Lesser Rings isn't used by his father. but it's alluded to. The fact that there were a great many magic rings was mentioned, and 3, 7, 9, and 1 were of special potency, so this tells us that there were other rings that were not of special potency. Now, as the text evolved and the story changed, Sauron no longer made many magic rings, but rather he taught the craft to the elves, and the lesser rings were essentially their practice attempts before they got serious. They are not counted among the rings of power, so lesser rings of power is kind of an oxymoron. They can't be both. They're either lesser rings or they're rings of power. That being said, we don't know anything else, not how many there were, and certainly not what they actually do. But I could surmise Saruman makes himself a ring later on in The Lord of the Rings, though what function it has, if any, is unknown. It must have had some magic, because otherwise it's just jewelry. And Saruman wouldn't be bragging about just making an ordinary ring that has no magic. The change in Saruman, at least from the perspective of Gandalf in the scene, is that, Saruman reveals that he has made a ring, is his robes. I'm going to read you that section. Radagast the Brown, laughed Saruman, and he no longer concealed his scorn. Radagast the bird tamer, Radagast the simple, Radagast the fool. Yet he had just the wit to play the part that I set him, for you have come. And that was all the purpose of my message. And here you will stay, Gandalf the Grey, and rest from journeys. For I am Saruman the Wise, Saruman Ring-maker, Saruman of many colours. I looked then and saw that his robes, which had seemed white, were not so, but were woven of all colours, as if he moved, and if he moved, they shimmered and changed hues, so that the eye was bewildered. That Saruman's rainbow robes are introduced while he's talking about his ring for the first time always leads me to believe, at least, that this is what the ring is doing. It's causing this shimmering rainbow effect in his robes. It doesn't sound like a great power, and it's not an actual use in a practical sense, but he's using it symbolically state that he has transcended the white and become of many colors. Of course, Gandalf tells him he preferred the white robes, and if I had been there, I would have maybe educated Saruman just a little bit on color theory and told him, hey man, white is already literally all the colors, which is probably the entire point of the head wizard being called the White. But hey, I wasn't there because it's a book. So that being said, what did the elvish lesser rings actually do? Probably not a whole lot. The fact that Gandalf knew that Bilbo's ring made him invisible, which isn't exactly accurate, but we'll go with that word, invisible, and that he hoped that it might have been one of the lesser rings, tells us that it is possible that some of, or possibly all of the lesser rings may have rendered you invisible, just with no other effects. All right, let's move on to the next question. Our next question comes in by the request of Adam Gorowski, who asks, if Saruman had traveled to Rivendell after capturing Gandalf, would he have been welcomed? Could he have convinced Elrond and others that Gandalf was the traitor instead? Would Gandalf's escape and arrival at Rivendell have changed their minds? There is no reason that Saruman would do this. Saruman had no reason to go to Rivendell. It's often, I think, misunderstood that the Council of Elrond was this sort of big thing that everyone knew about, and that they traveled to Rivendell specifically to attend it, as if there were invitations set out. The fact is that Gandalf told Frodo, bring the One Ring to Rivendell, and then after he arrived, they decided to have a meeting about what to do about the ring. Boromir was there because of a dream that he and his brother Faramir shared. Gimli was there, along with his father Gloin, because they wanted to warn Bilbo that Sauron was looking for him and to ask Elrond for advice. Galdor was there on some unknown errand from Círdan. Bilbo and Erestor and Glorfindel lived there. Arwen was there to see her father. Legolas was there to give news that Gollum had escaped from his father's custody. You see where I'm going with this? The only mention of a summoning is that Elrond muses during the meeting, maybe I should have invited this Tom Bombadil guy to the council, and Gandalf says that would have been useless, he wouldn't have come. So we have to understand that the reason that Saruman detained Gandalf was because Saruman was convinced that Gandalf knew about the location of the One Ring, and that it's all tied up with hobbits, because the Nazgul had showed up in Isengard at one point asking, hey, where do hobbits live? There's nothing to connect it to Rivendell. Saruman would not attempt to convince the likes of, Elrond that Gandalf was a traitor, because it wouldn't work, and he knew it. A very large part of Saruman's contempt for Gandalf was the fact that he was so beloved by the likes of Elrond and Galadriel, and Círdan even gave him a ring of power. I think Saruman was smart enough to know that trying to convince them that their favorite wizard was a traitor would be too difficult, and what would it really accomplish? What would be the use of convincing Elrond that Gandalf was evil if he had already captured him? And let's just say, just for the sake of discussion, that Saruman lost all his wits and suddenly decided to travel to Rivendell. The fact is that even doing that, Gandalf was probably still going to beat him there. It was a very, very long journey, and Gandalf had the speed of Shadowfax. Even if Saruman had a few days head start, I think Gandalf was going to arrive there first. All right, let's move on to the last question. Our final question comes in by the request of the Oski Boski, who asks, did Eru ever visit Valinor personally? So when I looked at this question, there was somebody else that answered it before I did, and they sort of gave this, God is everywhere, so yeah. I don't think that actually answers the question, and I think it's reductive. No, Eru never visited Valinor personally, nor did he visit Middle-earth. While it is true that Eru Ilúvatar is omnipresent, meaning that he's everywhere all at once, that doesn't mean that saying that is addressing the question at all, and it's just sort of avoiding it. We know that he's aware of everything that's happening, and he does not need to physically be there to commune with the Valar. We see this with him speaking as a disembodied voice to the thoughts of Ale. We also know that he is aware of how everything will end. But the ending was veiled from the Valar and the Maiar as well, the Ainur, showing them only the beginning of the vision that preceded creation. So that being said, Ilúvatar did not walk around in either Middle-earth or the Undying Lands at any point during the Legendarium. He stayed outside of the created world at all time. In Letter 297, Tolkien describes God as only approachable through the thoughts of the Valar, and largely forgotten in the world, save through being remembered by some of the sons of Númenor. We see this in The Lord of the Rings. Faramir offers a quick and silent prayer, the only such prayer to be seen during this time period. Gandalf alludes to God when he says the secret fire, but he's not invoking him, he's just stating his allegiance to him. It could be surmised that as Tolkien wanted to create this mythical history that would not contradict his own faith, that Ilúvatar will eventually incarnate and walk around the earth as Jesus. But that's not part of his story. Even Tolkien's proposed apocalypse, the Dagor-Dagorath, is not like the biblical revelations because it does not, Revelation, there's only one, as it does not involve Ilúvatar or Jesus walking the earth, but rather his agents, Tulkas, who's a Vala, Eanwa, who's a Maya, Eärendil, who's an elf, and Túrin, who's a man, to destroy Melkor, who is Satan, in a final battle. And this was an idea that, he eventually dropped this idea, but it's interesting to note that even in this final battle of battles, he keeps God out of the story. He keeps God out of the physical world, and this is likely to show that his words, God's words, not Tolkien's words, at the start of the Silmarillion are true. I'm going to read you that part. Mighty are the Arnor, and mightiest among them is Melkor, but that he may know. And all the Ainur that I am Ilúvatar, those things that ye have sung, I will show them forth, that ye may see what ye have done, and thou, Melkor, shall see that no theme may be played that hath not its uttermost source in me, nor can any alter the music in my despite. For he that attempteth this shall prove but mine instrument in the devising of things more wonderful, which he himself hath not imagined. Even before it's all begun. He's declaring victory over Melkor. He's telling him there's nothing you can do that's going to change the fate of the world in any sort of meaningful way. The evil that Melkor introduces will turn to good, though still remain evil, as Namo would later point out. He doesn't need to enter the world to change the course of the story, and he rarely intervenes directly in events, the largest of which was the Akalabath, which was asked of him by Manwë. Manwë decided at this point to lay down his stewardship of the world momentarily and call on the big boss. And, you know, you shouldn't have pushed him that far because it was pretty terrible. All right, that was our final question, but now let's move on to the quiz review. Welcome to the quiz review. Of course, I post quizzes every single day on the community tab, so if you're subscribed to the channel, you're probably getting those through your feed. And of course, you can, see about getting them right. They're just for fun. Keep in mind, I can't actually see who gets things right and who gets them wrong. I can only see the percentages of people that get them right or wrong. So let's start with this one. Who is the first of Tolkien's published letters addressed to? So the choices that I gave here was his son Christopher, his mother, his future wife, and a colleague. And as you can see, the correct answer was his future wife, which is not exactly in first place here. It's in third place. Most of you, or I should say a plurality, went for his son Christopher. Was not born yet at the time. So letter 1 is addressed to Edith Bratt, who was his fiancée, and it was written while he was still an undergraduate in Oxford. So there you have it. Okay, moving on to the next one, and this follows from the previous quiz. Who was Tolkien's final published letter addressed to? And the choices that I gave were his daughter Priscilla, his publisher, a fan, or his son John. And once again, not quite a plurality here, although this came in second place. The correct answer that 28% of you got right was his daughter Priscilla. This is letter 354. It was addressed to Priscilla Tolkien and is mostly minutia, just sort of chit-chat. He's talking about the weather. He's talking about eating curry for lunch. He's talking about he got a haircut and that he misses his daughter, and that's really all. He actually died 4 days after he wrote that letter, so pretty sad stuff. Most of you, or I should say a plurality of you, went for it was his son John, but no, it was actually his daughter in that case. Here's our next one. What is the Festitokalon? And I'm happy to see that most of you got this right. Not a majority, but a plurality here. So the choices were a creature that burrows on the earth, a sprite-like spirit from the Book of Lost Tales, a breakfast food favored by Ents, or a mythical turtle that pretends to be an island. That is, of course, the correct answer. If you want to read the poem, Festitokalon is found in the Adventures of Tom Bombadil, or many of the collections of short fiction that includes the Adventures of Tom Bombadil, such as Tales from the Perilous Realm or the Tolkien Reader. The idea, it was sort of this hobbitish poem that possibly was inspired by Tol Eressëa, or the idea of Tol Eressëa, this moving island, and that it was really just this massive sea turtle that if you stepped on it, it would flip over and drown you. So there you have it. There's a poem called Festitokalon. I think you guys did pretty well on that, probably because I've talked about it on the channel. I try to put in stuff that I've talked about so that you guys, stand a fighting chance here. Here's our next one. What is the name of the dragon in Farmer Giles of Ham? And so our choices are Chrysophylax divus. It says Chrysophax, and I got to tell you, I was writing this one on my phone. This is my phone's fault. It's Chrysophylax, not Chrysophax, and it's a PH, not with an F, and it kept auto-correcting to Chrysophax, and I'm like, why does it keep doing that? And I thought I had it set to actually write Chrysophylax, but that is the correct answer. I put in these other ones. I wanted to see if anybody sort of got the joke here. Parthenax is one of the dragons in the video game Skyrim. Vermithrax Pejorative was a dragon in a movie called Dragon Slayer, and Skaith the Worm is one of Tolkien's dragons. It was mentioned in the appendix of The Lord of the Rings, and there's also a poem called Skaith the Worm. But however, that's The Lord of the Rings. That's not Farmer Giles of Ham. So 28% of you got this right. A lot of you guys went for Skaith the Worm, which is interesting. I think there's a lot of, Skaith the Worm is sort of like in the discussion right now because the poem is sort of like recently revealed. But so that maybe that's why. But there you go. All right, here's our next one. Why are there so few Vanyar elves compared to Noldor and Teleri? So the answers that I gave you were many did not survive the great journey to Valinor. The first elf Eamon held off on reclaiming followers, hoping to claim more later. They were selective of who they accepted, or they had less children than the other clans, which that's the one that 44% of you went to. But in second place is the correct answer. Eamon was the first elf, and he had his followers, and every time they came to a grouping of elves, the first three elves, Imil, Enil, and Tata, the next one would sort of claim them as his followers. And Eamon was like, hey, every group we run into is bigger than the last, and I'm sort of getting shafted here, so I'm just going to hold off and see when we get to a big group. But that never happened because there were only 144, so he wound up with the smallest amount of followers, which were called the Iminyar, later renamed to the Vanyar. So there you have it. And a lot of you guys who did know that probably knew it because I read that part, the Awakening of the Elves, on one of my lives during the period that I did not have a computer, and I was doing readings for anybody that made donations to the cause, so there's that as well. Okay, our next one. Which dwarf founded the realm of Erebor? We have Thrain the Second, Thrain the First, Thrain the Second, Thorin the First, Thrain the First, and then Thror the First. Correct answer, and the majority, or I should say the plurality of you got it, 41%. It was Thrain the First. He was the son of Nain the First, who was the last king of Moria, and he founded Erebor and was called the first king under the mountain. And here's our final one. In the Book of Lost Tales, what are the names of the first two mortal men to awaken? So this is a tough one, but look at that. An actual good plurality of you guys, 38% got it, is Irmun and Elmir. The other answers are Ing and Elfwine, Morak and Beor, and Halidin and Haleth. The only other one that's actually from the Book of Lost Tales were Ing and Elfwine, and they were actually the descendants of Irman and Elmir. Morak and Beor and Halidin and Haleth are all characters from the published Silmarillion, not the Book of Lost Tales. So there you go. So you guys did pretty well. There weren't any like last week we had one where the correct answer was in last place, the one about the asteroids, and a lot of you guys, well, surely Galadriel has an asteroid named after her, but no, believe it or not, no. All those other ones, yes, but not Galadriel for whatever reason. I guess they figure maybe asteroids are too ugly to call Galadriel. Anyway, that's the video, you guys. If you got through the whole thing and you haven't subscribed yet, well, what the heck, man? Subscribe now. Hit the like button. Hit the hype button. It does do something. I've been seeing it in my my analytics that are sent to me every week. So if you happen to see, you hit the like, and then if it says hype, hit that, because what that actually does, I looked into it, is it pushes the video out to more people. It's saying not only did I like this video, but I'm recommending it to other people. You don't actually have to recommend it to other people. You're just telling YouTube to recommend it to other people. And this is something that only like the first, somewhat, first grouping of people that like the video are going to see that. But that's how it works. You hit the like, and if it says hype, hit it again for me, because it helps. Anyway, guys, we will see you next week. And if you want to do something greater than subscribing, I'll ask to maybe consider membership. Membership is a very low cost of $5 a month, and you get to see all of the videos early, most of them at least a week early, some of them more than a week early. You get cool badges and emotes to go along with lives, and yeah. And you get the wonderful feeling of helping a YouTuber out who does a lot of work. So I'll see you guys next time.